In the untamed wilderness of 1830s Mississippi Territory, where the morning mist clung to ancient cypress trees and the sound of paddle wheels echoed across muddy rivers, destinies could change with a single decision. Where white settlers pushed westward with dreams of fortune and Native American tribes fought to preserve their ancestral lands, an unexpected love story would unfold that defied every boundary society had drawn. When 17-year-old Margaret O'Sullivan was traded like a sack of grain to settle her father's gambling debts, she believed her life was over. Little did she know that the rough hands of fate were about to place her directly in the path of Ayana, a Choctaw warrior, whose very presence would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and what it meant to truly belong somewhere. This is the story of a ring forged in tradition, a love that crossed cultures, and a woman who discovered that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find who you're meant to become. Margaret O'Sullivan pressed her face against the rough wooden slats of the wagon, watching her childhood home disappear behind a curtain of dust and regret. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the canvas cover above her head, and the constant jolting of wheels against rocky ground made her stomach churn with more than just motion sickness. Every bump in the trail reminded her of how far she was traveling from everything familiar, everything safe. The man driving the wagon, Samuel Perkins, hadn't spoken a word to her since loading her few belongings at dawn. His weathered hands gripped the reins with the same casual indifference he might show toward a piece of livestock. That comparison wasn't lost on Margaret. After all, that's exactly what she had become. Property to be transferred, a debt to be settled, a problem to be solved. Her father, Patrick O'Sullivan, had always been a gambling man. Margaret remembered countless nights when he would stumble home, reeking of whiskey and tobacco, his pockets either bulging with unexpected winnings or turned inside out in defeat. Her mother had died 3 years ago, leaving Margaret to manage their small household while Patrick chased his next big score. She had learned to stretch pennies into dollars, to make soup from bones, and to ignore the worried glances from neighbors who whispered about the O'Sullivan family's decline in fortunes. But this time was different. This time, Patrick had lost more than he could ever repay. The debt belonged to a man named Joshua Brennan, a land speculator who had been buying up property throughout Mississippi Territory. Patrick had been so confident in his hand that night, 4 kings, he'd told her later, with tears streaming down his face. He had bet everything, their small farm, their few remaining possessions, and when those weren't enough to match Brennan's raise, he had bet his daughter. Margaret pulled her thin shawl tight around her shoulders, though the gesture provided little comfort in the oppressive heat. She tried not to think about what awaited her at Brennan's settlement. The man was known for his harsh treatment of workers and his eye for young women. Some said he already had 3 wives, though only one was legal. Others whispered darker things about what happened to the girls who disappeared into his household. The wagon lurched to a sudden stop, jolting Margaret from her dark thoughts. Samuel finally spoke, his voice rough as sandpaper. "River crossing ahead. Might take some time." Margaret peered through the gap in the canvas and saw they had reached the banks of a wide, muddy river. Several other wagons and riders had formed a line waiting for the ferry, a ramshackle wooden platform operated by 2 men who looked as though they had been carved from the very driftwood that littered the shoreline. As they waited, Margaret noticed a group of Native Americans on horseback approaching the crossing from the opposite direction. Even from a distance, she could see they moved with a fluid grace that spoke of generations spent in harmony with the land. Their horses seemed to dance rather than walk, and their riders sat with the kind of natural confidence that Margaret had rarely seen among the white settlers she knew. Samuel noticed her attention and spat into the dust beside the wagon. "Choctaw," he said with undisguised distaste. "Government's been trying to move them west for years." Some are finally getting the message. Margaret had heard stories about the Indian Removal Act, but seeing these people in person made the reality of it hit home in a way that newspaper accounts never could. These weren't the savage warriors of penny novels and campfire stories. They were families. She could see children clinging to their mothers, elderly men with faces lined by decades of wisdom, young women who carried themselves with a dignity that Margaret envied. The ferry operator gestured for Samuel's wagon to board. As they rolled onto the creaking platform, Margaret found herself directly across from the Choctaw group. One of the younger men caught her attention immediately. He sat taller than the others, his long black hair adorned with a single eagle feather that caught the sunlight. His face was angular and proud, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around him without judgment. When those eyes met Margaret's, she felt something shift inside her chest, a flutter of recognition that made no logical sense. He studied her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but instead she found herself unable to look away. There was intelligence in his gaze, and something else that made her breath catch. Compassion. The ferry pushed off from the bank with a grinding sound of wood against wood. The current was stronger than expected, and the platform began to drift downstream. The ferry operators shouted at each other in panic as they struggled to maintain control. Margaret gripped the side of the wagon as water began to slosh over the edges of the ferry. That's when everything went wrong. A loose rope whipped across the platform, striking Samuel in the head and knocking him unconscious. The horses reared in terror, threatening to overturn the wagon entirely. Margaret screamed as she felt the entire ferry tilt dangerously to one side. Without hesitation, the young Choctaw warrior leaped from his horse onto the ferry. He moved with liquid grace, catching the loose rope and quickly securing it while simultaneously calming the panicked horses with a series of low, soothing sounds. His companions joined him, working together to stabilize the ferry and guide it safely to the opposite shore. When they finally reached solid ground, Margaret was shaking from more than just fear. The warrior approached her wagon and she got her first close look at him. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably not much older than her own 17 years, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced real danger and survived. "Are you hurt?" he asked in perfect English, though his voice carried the musical cadence of his native language. Margaret shook her head, not trusting her voice. Samuel was beginning to stir, groaning as he touched the growing lump on his forehead. The warrior's eyes never left Margaret's face. "You are afraid," he observed quietly, "but not of me." It wasn't a question, and Margaret found herself nodding before she could stop herself. There was something about this stranger that made her want to tell him everything. About her father's debts, about where she was being taken, about the future that awaited her at Joshua Brennan's settlement. "I am Ayana," he said, placing his hand over his heart in what Margaret realized was a formal introduction. "It means eternal blossom in my language, though my friends call me A. Margaret," she whispered, then added more strongly, "Margaret O'Sullivan." Margaret O'Sullivan. Samuel had recovered enough to scowl at their conversation. "That's enough socializing," he said roughly, though Margaret noticed he didn't dare meet Ayana's eyes directly. "We need to keep moving." Ayana stepped back, but his gaze remained fixed on Margaret. "Where do you travel?" he asked. "Brennan's settlement," Samuel answered before Margaret could speak. "And it's none of your business, Indian." Something dangerous flickered in Ayana's dark eyes, but his voice remained calm. "Joshua Brennan is not a good man," he said quietly, speaking directly to Margaret. "My people have had dealings with him. He takes what does not belong to him." Samuel reached for the rifle that lay beside him on the wagon seat. "I said, that's enough. Move along now before there's trouble." Ayana's companions had noticed the tension and were moving closer, their hands resting casually on their own weapons. Margaret realized that violence was only a heartbeat away, and the thought terrified her more than anything that had happened so far. "Please," she said quickly, looking at Ayana with desperate eyes. "Don't fight because of me. I'm not worth it." The warrior's expression softened. "Every person has worth," he said simply. "Every life has value. That is the way of my people." He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something small. Before Samuel could react, Ayana stepped forward and pressed the object into Margaret's palm. It was a small carved stone, smooth and warm from being carried close to his body. "For protection," he said quietly, "and to remember that you are not alone in this world." Samuel cracked his whip over the horses' heads, and the wagon lurched forward. Margaret clutched the stone tightly as she watched Ayana grow smaller in the distance. Even after she could no longer see him, she continued to stare back down the trail they had traveled, wondering if she would ever see those compassionate dark eyes again. The rest of the journey passed in a blur of dust and heat. Samuel remained surly and uncommunicative, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses or for brief, uncomfortable nights around smoky campfires. Margaret found herself thinking constantly about her encounter with Ayana. She examined the carved stone he had given her countless times, running her fingers over its smooth surface and trying to decipher the intricate symbols etched into it. As they drew closer to Brennan's settlement, the landscape began to change. The wild beauty of the frontier gave way to cleared fields and rough wooden buildings. They passed groups of workers, some white, some black, some who might have been Native American, all laboring under the harsh supervision of armed overseers. Margaret noticed that none of them looked up as the wagon passed, as if they had learned that curiosity was dangerous. On their final night before reaching the settlement, Samuel finally spoke to her directly. "You'd best understand how things work at Brennan's place," he said, stirring the coals of their small fire with a stick. "Keep your head down, do what you're told, and don't cause trouble. Brennan doesn't tolerate disobedience, especially from women." Margaret wrapped her arms around her knees and stared into the flames. "What exactly will I be expected to do?" Samuel's laugh was bitter. "Whatever Brennan wants you to do. You're his property now, girl, same as his horses or his land. The sooner you accept that, the easier things will go for you." That night, Margaret barely slept. She lay on the hard ground, staring up at the stars, clutching Ayana's stone and wondering what kind of life awaited her. Would she spend her days scrubbing floors and tending gardens? Would she be forced to share Brennan's bed? The possibilities terrified her, but even worse was the growing certainty that she would never see her home again, never see her father again, despite everything he had done to her. They reached Brennan's settlement the next morning as the sun was climbing toward its peak. The place was larger than Margaret had expected, sprawling across several acres of cleared land. The main house was a two-story wooden structure with wide porches and multiple chimneys, impressive by frontier standards but somehow menacing in its isolation. Outbuildings dotted the property, barns, workshops, quarters for workers that looked more like prison barracks than homes. Joshua Brennan himself emerged from the house as their wagon approached. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with prematurely grey hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. His clothing was fine but practical, a white shirt, dark vest, and polished boots that spoke of wealth and authority. "Samuel," he called out in a booming voice. "Right on time. I was beginning to wonder if you'd run into trouble on the road." "No trouble, Mr. Pitts." "Brennan," Samuel replied, though Margaret noticed he seemed nervous in the man's presence. "Brought you what you asked for, safe and sound." Brennan's gaze fell on Margaret and she felt herself being evaluated like livestock at market. He walked slowly around the wagon, studying her from different angles while she fought the urge to shrink away from his inspection. "Stand up, girl," he commanded. "Let me get a proper look at you." Margaret rose on unsteady legs, acutely aware of her travel-stained dress and tangled hair. Brennan nodded with apparent satisfaction. "She'll do nicely," he said to Samuel. "Patrick described her well enough, but seeing her in person confirmed she's worth what he owed me. Maybe more." The casual way he discussed her value made Margaret's stomach turn, but she bit her tongue and remained silent. Samuel helped her down from the wagon and unloaded her few belongings. A small trunk containing her mother's few dresses and personal items, and a bundle of bedding. "Ruth," Brennan called toward the house. "Come show our new addition where she'll be staying." An older woman emerged from the main house, her grey hair pulled back severely and her dress plain but clean. She looked Margaret up and down with tired eyes that held neither warmth nor hostility, just the weary resignation of someone who had seen too many young women arrive at this place. "Come along then," Ruth said briskly. "Best get you settled before the day gets any hotter." Margaret gathered her belongings and followed Ruth toward a long, low building behind the main house. Behind them, she could hear Brennan settling his account with Samuel, their voices gradually fading as the wagon departed. "That's the women's quarters," Ruth explained as they walked. "You'll share a room with two other girls. Keep to yourself, do your work, and you'll get along fine enough. Cause trouble, and you'll wish you hadn't." Ruth led her to a cramped room containing 3 narrow beds and a single chest for storing personal belongings. "Mary and Sarah will be your roommates," Ruth continued. "They're in the fields right now, but you'll meet them tonight. Your duties will be explained tomorrow. But for today you can rest and get your bearings. Supper is at sunset, and you're expected to be there." After Ruth left, Margaret sat on what she assumed would be her bed and tried to process everything that had happened. Less than a week ago, she had been living in her father's house, poor but free. Now she was the property of a man she had never met, trapped in a place that felt more like a prison than a home. She pulled Ayana's stone from her pocket and held it up to catch what little light filtered through the small window. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to dance in the dim light, and for a moment she could almost hear his voice again. "Every person has worth. Every life has value." Margaret closed her eyes and made a silent promise to herself. Whatever happened at Brennan's settlement, whatever she was forced to endure, she would not let them break her spirit. She would find a way to escape, or at least to survive until opportunity presented itself. She had no way of knowing that opportunity would come sooner than she expected, and that it would arrive in the form of the same dark-eyed warrior who had already begun to change her destiny. As the sun set over the settlement that evening, Margaret joined the other residents for supper in a large common room. The meal was simple but adequate: cornbread, beans, and salt pork served on rough wooden plates. She sat between her new roommates, Mary and Sarah, both of whom seemed kind enough but worn down by their circumstances. The room fell silent when Brennan entered, and Margaret understood immediately that his presence changed everything. He walked among the tables like a feudal lord inspecting his subjects, occasionally stopping to speak quietly to one of the workers. When he reached Margaret's table, he placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "I trust you're settling in well," he said, his voice carrying a tone of ownership that made her skin crawl. "Tomorrow we'll discuss your specific duties. I have some ideas about how to best utilize your particular talents." Margaret nodded silently, not trusting herself to speak. After Brennan moved on, Sarah leaned close to her ear. "Word of advice," she whispered. "Whatever he asks you to do, just do it. The last girl who tried to refuse." She didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear enough. That night, lying in her narrow bed between two strangers, Margaret stared at the ceiling and wondered how many other young women had lain in this same spot, contemplating the same hopeless future. The stone from Ayana rested beneath her pillow, its smooth warmth the only comfort she had in this place of shadows and fear. She was just beginning to drift off to sleep when she heard it, the soft sound of horses approaching the settlement. Through the thin walls, she could hear voices raised in alarm, followed by the unmistakable sound of Brennan shouting orders. Margaret sat up, straining to hear what was happening, but Mary grabbed her arm. "Stay down!" Mary hissed. "Don't get involved in whatever's going on out there. It never ends well." But Margaret's heart was racing for a different reason. Something in the rhythm of those approaching hoofbeats reminded her of another group of horsemen, ones who moved with the fluid grace of people born to the saddle. As impossible as it seemed, she found herself hoping that somewhere in the darkness beyond these walls, a pair of compassionate dark eyes was looking for her. The commotion outside gradually died down, but Margaret remained awake for hours, clutching Ayana's stone and wondering if her life was about to change once again. 3 weeks at Brennan's settlement had taught Margaret more about survival than 17 years of ordinary life ever could. She had learned to move silently through the corridors of the women's quarters, to keep her eyes downcast when Brennan was near, and to find small moments of peace in the endless cycle of work that defined each day. Her duties, as it turned out, were primarily domestic. She spent her mornings in the main house, scrubbing floors and dusting furniture under the watchful eye of Ruth, who had warned to her slightly but remained cautious about showing too much kindness. Afternoons were reserved for laundry, a back-breaking task that left her hands raw and her back aching. Evenings brought kitchen work, preparing meals for the settlement's growing population of workers and residents. But it wasn't the physical labor that wore her down, it was the constant fear. Brennan had not yet forced his attentions on her, but Margaret could feel his eyes following her movements throughout the day. He had taken to requesting that she personally serve his meals, a task that required her to enter his private study where the walls seemed to close in around her. During these encounters, he would speak to her in a low, intimate voice that made her skin crawl, discussing his plans for expanding the settlement and his need for someone he could trust to help manage his household. The other women had warned her that this was how it always started. Brennan liked to think of himself as a gentleman, they said. He would court his victims with gifts and special attention before making his true intentions clear. The fact that he legally owned her only made his eventual demands more inevitable. On this particular morning, Margaret was hanging laundry behind the main house when she noticed unusual activity near the settlement's main gate. A group of riders had arrived, but instead of the typical traders or government officials who occasionally visited, these men wore the blue uniforms of territorial militia. Their leader, a thin man with a carefully waxed mustache, was speaking animatedly with Brennan, their conversation punctuated by sharp gestures toward the surrounding forest. Margaret tried to listen while continuing her work, but could only catch fragments of their discussion. She heard mentions of renegade Indians and unauthorized settlements before Brennan noticed her proximity and sharply ordered her to move her work elsewhere. As she relocated her laundry basket, Margaret noticed movement in the tree line beyond the settlement's cleared fields. For just a moment, she thought she saw the flash of sunlight on dark hair and the outline of a figure on horseback. Her heart leaped, but when she looked again, there was nothing there. That evening brought unexpected excitement to the settlement. During supper, Brennan stood before the assembled residents with news that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying the false warmth he used when addressing his workers, "I want you all to be aware that there have been reports of hostile Indian activity in the area. A group of Choctaw renegades has been raiding isolated farms and threatening peaceful settlers. Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her pocket, where Ayana's stone rested against her fingers. The idea that he could be involved in raiding settlements seemed impossible. The man who had risked his life to help strangers on a ferry, who had spoken of the worth of every person, could not be the same person Brennan was describing. For your safety, Brennan continued, I'm implementing new security measures. No one is to leave the settlement grounds without permission. The militia will be conducting patrols, and any unauthorized Indians found in the area will be dealt with accordingly. Sarah, sitting beside Margaret, noticed her reaction to the announcement. You look pale, she whispered. Are you feeling all right? Margaret forced herself to nod, but her mind was racing. If Ayana and his people were truly in the area, what were they doing? Were they actually raiding farms, as Brennan claimed? Or was there something else going on? Something that the territorial militia and men like Brennan didn't want the general population to know about. Her questions were answered sooner than she expected. 2 nights later, Margaret was awakened by a sound so soft she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. A gentle tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, was coming from the small window above her bed. Mary and Sarah remained deeply asleep, exhausted by another day of back-breaking labor. Margaret slipped quietly from her bed and pressed her face to the window. At first, she saw only darkness and shadows. Then a figure stepped into the moonlight, and her breath caught in her throat. Ayana stood below her window, dressed in dark clothing that helped him blend with the shadows. He raised his hand in greeting, then gestured for her to come outside. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what he was asking. Leaving the women's quarters at night was strictly forbidden. If she were caught, the consequences would be severe. But something in his eyes, even visible in the dim moonlight, told her this was important. She dressed quickly in her darkest dress and slipped on her shoes. The door to the women's quarters was always locked from the outside, but Margaret had discovered during her first week that one of the windows in the common room could be forced open if you knew exactly how to manipulate the warped frame. She crept through the dormitory, past sleeping women who had learned not to notice things that weren't their business, and made her way to the window. It took several minutes of careful work to open it without making noise, but finally she was able to slip through and drop silently to the ground outside. Ayana materialized from the shadows like a ghost, taking her hand and leading her away from the buildings toward the tree line. They moved in complete silence, his knowledge of the terrain allowing him to guide her around obstacles she couldn't even see in the darkness. Only when they were deep enough in the forest to be hidden from view did he finally speak. I have been watching the settlement, he said quietly, his voice carrying the same compassionate tone she remembered from their first meeting, waiting for a chance to speak with you.
You shouldn't be here, Margaret whispered, though her heart soared at seeing him again.
They say you and your people have been raiding farms. The militia is looking for you. Ayana's expression darkened. We do not raid innocent people, he said firmly. But Brennan has been stealing from us, taking our horses, our supplies, things we need for the journey west. When we asked him to return what was ours, he threatened to call the militia. Now he spreads lies to justify what he plans to do to us. The pieces began to fall into place for Margaret. She had wondered why the settlement seemed to have an unusually large number of horses for a farming community, and why some of the tools and equipment looked newer and more valuable than what frontier settlers typically owned. He's been stealing from you, she said, the realization making her stomach turn. And now he's using the militia to eliminate the witnesses. Ayana finished grimly. My people are camped nearby, preparing for the final journey west as the government demands. We want no trouble with anyone. But Brennan knows that once we are gone, no one will ever know what he has taken from us. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. What about the other settlers, the families on isolated farms? Are they in danger too? Some have already been warned, Ayana said. Others, Brennan has convinced them that we are the threat. They will help the militia hunt us, believing they are protecting themselves. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between them. Margaret realized that she was witnessing something much larger than her own personal troubles, a conflict that would determine the fate of Ayana's entire community. Why did you come here tonight? She asked finally. It's too dangerous for you to be this close to the settlement. Ayana stepped closer, and in the moonlight filtering through the trees, Margaret could see the intensity in his dark eyes. Because you do not belong in that place, he said simply. I have watched how they treat you, how Brennan looks at you. I know what kind of man he is. Margaret's breath caught. You've been watching me? From a distance, Ayana confirmed. You are different from the others there. You still have hope in your eyes, still have fight in your spirit. I could not leave this place knowing you would be trapped there forever. The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Margaret understood what he was offering. Escape from Brennan's settlement, freedom from a future that held nothing but misery and degradation. But she also understood what accepting would mean. If I left with you, she said slowly, I would be an outlaw. There would be no going back to my old life, no returning to white society.
Is that life worth returning to? Ayana asked gently.
The father who sold you like property, the society that allows men like Brennan to own other human beings. Margaret thought of her father, probably drunk in some tavern, at this very moment, having convinced himself that he had done what was necessary for their family's survival. She thought of the militiamen who would hunt down an entire community to cover up one man's crimes. She thought of the future that awaited her in Brennan's settlement, years of servitude, followed by whatever darker fate he had planned for her. Then she thought of the stone in her pocket, warm against her fingers, and the man who had given it to her. A man who believed that every person had worth, that every life had value. When would we leave? She asked. Ayana's relief was visible even in the dim light. Tomorrow night, he said. The militia plans to attack our camp at dawn the day after tomorrow. Brennan has told them we will be unprepared, that we are just a small group of renegades without weapons or defenses. But you are prepared? A grim smile crossed Ayana's face. We are Choctaw. We have been preparing for war longer than these white soldiers have been alive, but we do not wish to fight if it can be avoided. We plan to leave tomorrow night, before the attack comes. Margaret nodded, her decision crystallizing even as fear clawed at her stomach. What do I need to do? Be ready to leave quickly, Ayana instructed. Bring nothing that will weigh you down, nothing that will mark you as belonging to this place. When you see my signal tomorrow night, an owl call from the forest edge, come to this same window. I will be waiting. He turned to go, then paused and looked back at her. Margaret, he said softly, and the way he spoke her name made her heart flutter. Are you certain about this? Once you leave with us, there will be dangers you have never faced. We cannot guarantee your safety. Margaret thought about the question seriously. Life with Ayana's people would indeed be dangerous. They were fugitives now, hunted by the government and hated by many white settlers. There would be hardship, uncertainty, possibly violence. But when she compared that to the certain misery that awaited her at Brennan's settlement, the choice became clear. I'm certain, she said firmly. I would rather face unknown dangers with people who value my humanity than live in safety with those who see me as property. Ayana stepped closer, close enough that she could see the emotions playing across his face. Without warning, he reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers warm against her skin. You are brave, he said quietly. Braver than you know. My people will welcome you, but more than that, He paused, as if struggling with something he wanted to say.
What?
Margaret whispered. I have not been able to forget you, he admitted. Since that day at the river, you have been in my thoughts. I know this is not the time or place for such words, but I wanted you to understand why I am taking this risk. It's not just about justice for my people, though that matters greatly. It is also about you, about giving you the chance to live the life you deserve. Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her that way before, as if her happiness actually mattered to them. Her father had seen her as a burden, Brennan saw her as property, but Ayana saw her as a person worth protecting. I haven't been able to forget you either, she whispered back. Your stone has been my only comfort in this place. Ayana smiled, an expression of pure warmth that transformed his serious features. Then perhaps the spirits brought us together for a purpose, he said. Perhaps our meeting was not chance, but destiny. The sound of a dog barking in the distance reminded them both of the danger they were in. Ayana quickly guided Margaret back toward the settlement, moving through the forest with the same silent grace she remembered from their first meeting. Tomorrow night, he reminded her as they reached the edge of the clearing. Be ready. Margaret slipped back through the common room window and crept to her bed, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. In less than 24 hours, she would either be free or dead, but either fate seemed preferable to remaining where she was. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret went through the motions of a daily routine, but her mind was entirely focused on the evening ahead. She began to notice things she had overlooked before. The way Brennan's men positioned themselves around the settlement, the presence of additional guards near the weapon shed, the nervous energy that seemed to affect everyone from the militia officers to the kitchen staff. During the afternoon, while hanging laundry, she overheard a conversation between two of the militiamen that confirmed her worst fears about what was planned for the next day. "Colonel says we hit them just before dawn," one of the men was saying. "They'll still be asleep, won't know what's coming." "What about prisoners?" the other asked. The first man laughed coldly. "Colonel's orders are to leave no witnesses. These Indians have been causing trouble for too long, and the only way to send a message is to make sure none of them survive to tell their side of the story." Margaret's hand shook as she continued hanging clothes, trying to appear as if she hadn't heard anything. These men were planning massacre, not battle. They intended to kill every member of Ayana's community, including women and children, and then claim it was justified defense against savage raiders. That evening, Margaret sat through supper, in a state of barely controlled anxiety. Brennan seemed to be in particularly high spirits, joking with the militia officers and making toasts to peace and prosperity in the territory. Margaret forced herself to eat, knowing she would need her strength for whatever lay ahead, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. After the meal, she returned to the women's quarters with Mary and Sarah, who seemed to sense her nervousness but were too tired from their own labors to ask many questions. Margaret lay in bed, fully clothed, listening to the sounds of the settlement settling down for the night. Guards walked their patrols, horses shuffled in the stable, and slowly the voices from the main house faded into silence. Then, just as the settlement reached its quietest point, she heard it, the soft, haunting call of an owl, coming from the direction of the forest. Margaret's heart leaped into her throat. The signal. She slipped from her bed for the second night in a row, but this time she carried the small bundle she had secretly prepared, her mother's locket, the clothes she had worn on the journey from her father's house, and Ayana's stone. Everything else she left behind, including the life she had known for 17 years. The window in the common room seemed to open more easily this time, as if it too understood the urgency of her escape. Margaret dropped to the ground outside and immediately saw Ayana waiting for her near the tree line. He was not alone. Two other figures waited with him, both mounted on horses that stood as still as statues in the moonlight. Ayana approached her quickly, leading a fourth horse. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Margaret nodded, though her throat felt too tight for words. Ayana helped her mount the horse, his hand steady and reassuring as he guided her into the unfamiliar saddle. The animal was smaller than the workhorses she was used to seeing, but it felt strong and sure-footed beneath her. "Stay close to me," Ayana instructed as he mounted his own horse. "We have a long ride ahead of us, and we must reach my people before dawn." They rode in single file through the forest, following paths that were invisible to Margaret but seemed as clear as roads to her companions. The horses moved with surprising quiet, their hoofbeats muffled by centuries of fallen leaves. Margaret found herself marveling at the skill of both riders and mounts. This was clearly a group of people who had been born to this kind of travel. As they rode, Margaret tried not to think about what she was leaving behind. Instead, she focused on the feeling of freedom that was growing stronger with each mile they traveled, away from Brennan's settlement. The night air felt cleaner here in the deep forest, and for the first time in weeks she could breathe without feeling the weight of constant surveillance. After what felt like hours of riding, they began to hear the soft sounds of a large group of people and animals. Ayana led them toward a hidden valley where dozens of cooking fires cast dancing shadows against the trees. Margaret realized she was seeing a Choctaw community on the move. Families with all their possessions loaded onto horses and travois. Children sleeping in their mother's arms. Elderly men and women who carried the wisdom and history of their people in their lined faces. "My people," Ayana said simply as they dismounted. "Your people now, if you choose to make them so." As they approached the central fire, Margaret became aware that many eyes were upon her. She was clearly the only white person in the camp, and her presence caused a stir of curiosity and concern. An elderly woman approached them, her silver hair braided with colorful beads, and her dark eyes sharp with intelligence. "Grandmother," Ayana said respectfully. "This is Margaret, the woman I told you about." The elderly woman studied Margaret for a long moment, taking in everything from her simple dress to the way she held herself. When she spoke, her voice was warm but serious. "You are welcome here, child," she said in accented but clear English. "But you must understand, the path you have chosen will not be easy. You will face hardships and dangers that you have never known." "Are you prepared for this?" Margaret thought about all the hardships and dangers she had already faced, about the future that had been planned for her at Brennan's settlement, about the choice between certain misery and uncertain freedom. I am prepared, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. I have nowhere else to go, and I believe this is where I belong. The elderly woman smiled for the first time, and Margaret saw where Ayana had inherited his warmth and compassion. Then you are truly welcome among us, she said. I am Nayeli, Ayana's grandmother, and the eldest woman of our band. Come, child, there is much we must discuss before the sun rises. The pre-dawn hours passed in a blur of preparation and hushed conversations. Nayeli had taken Margaret under her wing, explaining the immediate dangers they faced and the journey that lay ahead. The Choctaw community was larger than Margaret had expected. Nearly 200 people of all ages, along with their horses, cattle, and precious possessions that represented generations of accumulated culture and history. We have been walking the path of tears for many months, Nayeli explained as they worked together to pack essential supplies. The government says we must go west, to lands we have never seen, and leave behind everything our ancestors knew. Many of our people have already made this journey. We are among the last. Margaret helped load travews and secure bundles, her hands learning the efficient motions that these people had perfected through months of practice. Around them, the community moved with quiet urgency. Everyone understood that their lives depended on being ready to move before the militia arrived at their previous camping spot.
What will happen to the settlement? Margaret asked as she worked.
To Brennan and his people? Brennan will discover that we are not where he told the militia we would be, Ayana answered, joining their conversation. He will claim we must have been warned, that we are more dangerous than he thought. This will give him excuse to increase his raids on other native communities, to take more of what does not belong to him. The injustice of it made Margaret's stomach turn. Can't the authorities be told the truth? Can't someone expose what he's doing? Nayeli and Ayana exchanged a look that spoke of hard experience. Who would believe the word of Indians against a white landowner? Nayeli asked gently. Who would care about justice for people the government has already decided to remove? As the eastern sky began to show the first hints of dawn, a scout rode into camp with urgent news. The militia was on the move, heading for the location where they expected to find the Choctaw community. They had perhaps an hour before the soldiers would discover their mistake and begin searching for the real camp. Time to go, Ayana announced, his voice carrying clearly through the camp. The response was immediate and coordinated. Within minutes, the entire community was in motion, following paths known only to them deeper into the wilderness. Margaret rode beside Nayeli, watching in amazement as 200 people and their animals moved through the forest like ghosts. Children who were too young to understand the danger of their situation remained quiet as if sensing the tension in their parents. Adults communicated in hand signals and whispered words, while scouts ranged ahead and behind to watch for pursuit. They traveled this way for 3 days, moving primarily at night and resting during the daylight hours in hidden camps. Margaret learned to sleep on the ground, to eat whatever food was available, and to ignore the aches and muscles she had never used before. But more than that, she learned about the people who had welcomed her into their community. She learned that Ayana was not just a warrior, but also a keeper of stories, one of the young men responsible for memorizing and preserving the oral history of his people. In the evenings, when they felt safe enough for conversation, he would share tales of Choctaw heroes and legends, weaving together history and mythology in ways that helped Margaret understand the depth of culture she was witnessing. She learned that Nayeli had been a healer before the removal, skilled in the use of plants and traditional medicines that could treat everything from wounds to broken hearts. The elderly woman began teaching Margaret about the herbs and roots they encountered on their journey, passing on knowledge that had been handed down through generations of women. Most importantly, Margaret learned that these people, despite having lost their homeland and facing an uncertain future, had not lost their dignity, their compassion, or their sense of community. They shared what little they had with generosity, protected their children and elderly with fierce determination, and faced each new challenge with a courage that humbled her. On the 4th day of their journey, everything changed. They had stopped to rest beside a small stream, allowing the horses to drink and the people to refill their water containers. Margaret was helping some of the women prepare a simple meal when Ayana approached with an expression of unusual seriousness. Margaret, he said, I need to speak with you privately. They walked apart from the main group, following the stream until they were hidden by a bend lined with willows. Ayana seemed to be struggling with something difficult to express, his usual composure replaced by obvious nervousness. What is it? Margaret asked, concerned by his demeanor. Ayana took a deep breath. My grandmother and the other elders have been discussing your situation, he said. As things stand now, You are a refugee among us, welcome and protected, but not truly one of us. This creates complications. Margaret felt a cold fear settling in her stomach. What kind of complications? If we are captured by the military, or if we encounter government agents on the trail west, your presence will raise questions we cannot answer satisfactorily. A white woman traveling with our people will be seen as evidence that we are kidnappers or renegades. This will bring punishment not just on you, but on our entire community. The logic was undeniable, and Margaret had been trying not to think about exactly this problem. Her decision to escape Brennan's settlement had been driven by desperation rather than careful planning, and she had not fully considered the consequences for the people who had helped her. "What are my options?" she asked quietly. Ayana's dark eyes met hers. "There is one way that your presence among us would be acceptable to any authority we might encounter," he said. "If you were not just a refugee, but a member of our community by marriage." Margaret's breath caught. "Marriage? To me?" Ayana clarified, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "It would not be a marriage of convenience only. I have already told you how I feel about you. But it would provide protection for both you and my people." Margaret stared at him, her mind racing. 3 weeks ago, she had been the property of Joshua Brennan, facing a future of servitude and abuse. Now, a man she barely knew but deeply admired was offering her not just protection, but partnership and love. "What would such a marriage mean?" she asked. "Among your people, I mean. What would be expected of me?" Ayana's expression softened. "It would mean that you truly become one of us, not just a guest. You would learn our ways, our language, our traditions. You would take your place among the women of our community and contribute your own skills and knowledge. And you would be my wife in all the ways that matter. Partner, companion, helpmate." "And children?" Margaret asked, surprising herself at the question. A smile played at the corners of Ayana's mouth. "If the spirits bless us with children, they would be raised as Choctaw, knowing their heritage and their place in our community. They would belong fully to both worlds, your ancestry and mine." Margaret looked around at the hidden camp, at the families preparing for another night of dangerous travel, at the children who played quiet games while their parents planned for an uncertain future. These people had risked their own safety to help her escape from Brennan's settlement. Now she had the chance to truly join them, to become part of something larger than herself. But more than that, she had the chance to build a life with a man who saw her as an equal, who valued her thoughts and feelings, who offered partnership rather than ownership. "How would the marriage ceremony work?" she asked. "What do I need to know?" Ayana's smile became radiant. "Is that a yes?" Margaret found herself smiling back. "It's a yes." That evening, word of the planned ceremony spread quietly through the camp. Margaret was touched by the response. Women she barely knew began offering items for her wedding outfit, while men approached Ayana with congratulations and advice. Even in their current circumstances, the community was determined to mark this important moment properly. Nayeli took charge of preparing Margaret for the ceremony, producing from her carefully guarded possessions a traditional Choctaw dress made of soft deer hide and decorated with intricate beadwork. As she helped Margaret change clothes, the elderly woman shared the significance of marriage in Choctaw culture. "Among our people," Nayeli explained, "marriage is not just the joining of two individuals, but the creation of new family connections. You will become my granddaughter, not just in law, but in truth. Our clan will be your clan. Our ancestors, your ancestors." The dress fit Margaret perfectly, as if it had been made for her. When she saw her reflection in the stream, she barely recognized herself. The frightened girl who had been traded away by her father was gone, replaced by a woman who stood tall and proud in clothing that spoke of dignity and belonging. The ceremony itself took place just after sunset, beside a small fire that provided the only light in the darkened camp. The community gathered in a circle, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames, as the tribal elder who would perform the ceremony began to speak in the melodious cadences of the Choctaw language. Margaret understood only fragments of what was being said, that the meaning was clear in the reverent tones and the solemn expressions of everyone present. This was sacred time, a moment when two lives would be joined, and the future of the community strengthened by new bonds. When it came time for the exchange of rings, Margaret was surprised to see Ayana produce 2 bands carved from the same dark wood as the stone he had given her at their first meeting. The rings were simple but beautiful, etched with symbols that Ayana explained represented harmony, protection, and eternal commitment. "These rings were carved by my grandfather," Ayana said as he placed one on Margaret's finger. "He made them for my parents' wedding, and they have been waiting for the day I would need them. He said that when the right woman appeared in my life, I would know her immediately, and these rings would fit her perfectly. The ring slid onto Margaret's finger as if it had been measured for her, warm and smooth against her skin. When she placed the matching band on Ayana's finger, she felt something shift in her heart, a sense of completion she had never experienced before. The elder pronounced them husband and wife in both Choctaw and English, and the community erupted in quiet celebration. Despite their dangerous circumstances, people produced musical instruments from their packs, and soon the night air was filled with the gentle sounds of traditional songs and dances. Margaret found herself swept into the celebration, learning the steps of simple dances and tasting foods that had been saved for special occasions. For the first time since leaving her father's house, she felt truly happy. More than happy, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Later, when the celebration had wound down and the camp had returned to its necessary quiet, Ayana led Margaret to a small shelter that had been prepared for them. It was simple, just a framework of bent saplings covered with hide and blankets, but it was private and cozy, a space that was entirely their own. They sat together beside a tiny fire, holding hands and talking in whispers about their hopes and fears for the future. Margaret learned that Ayana was 22 years old, that he had never been married before, and that he had begun to think he never would find someone who could understand both his devotion to his people and his dreams of building something new in the Western lands. "What are your dreams?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious about this man who was now her husband. "I want to help my people build a new life in Oklahoma Territory," Ayana replied. "Not just survive, but truly live, preserving our culture while also learning what we can from the white world that seems determined to change everything around us. I want to be a bridge between the old ways and the new ones." "And what about us?" Margaret asked. "What do you want for our life together?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment, staring into the small fire. "I want to give you happiness," he said finally. "I want you to feel safe and valued and loved every day of your life. I want us to face whatever challenges come together as equals and partners." Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes. "No one has ever wanted those things for me before," she whispered. "I spent my whole life being seen as a burden or a possession. You're the first person who has ever seen me as just me." Ayana turned to face her fully, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he said seriously. "To survive what you have survived, to choose freedom over safety, to trust strangers with your future, that takes a courage that most people never develop." When he kissed her for the first time, Margaret felt as though the last piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. This was what her life had been moving toward, not just escape from her past, but discovery of a future she had never dared to imagine. They were awakened before dawn by urgent voices outside their shelter. Margaret and Ayana dressed quickly and emerged to find the camp in controlled chaos. Scouts had returned with news that changed everything. "Military patrol," one of the young men reported breathlessly. "Large group, maybe 50 soldiers, heading directly for us. They'll be here within the hour." The community immediately began implementing plans they had clearly rehearsed many times before. Essential belongings were packed with practiced efficiency, while anything non-essential was abandoned. Children were awakened gently and prepared for another day of hard travel. But this time, there was nowhere to run. The scouts reported that the military patrol had surrounded the area, cutting off all the escape routes the Choctaw had been using. They were trapped. "What do we do?" Margaret asked Mayeli, fear making her voice shake. The elderly woman's expression was grim but determined. "We'd prepare to fight if we must," she said. "But first, we tried to talk." Sometimes soldiers can be reasoned with if they are approached properly. As the sun rose, the military patrol became visible through the trees. Margaret's heart sank when she recognized the officer leading the group. It was the same thin man with the waxed mustache who had been speaking with Brennan at the settlement. He was clearly someone who believed the lies about Choctaw raiders, rather than someone who might listen to reason. The officer called for the Choctaw leader to come forward for negotiations. The tribal elder who had performed Margaret and Ayana's wedding ceremony walked slowly toward the soldiers, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. Margaret watched from beside Ayana, her new husband's hand tight on her arm. The conversation between the elder and the military officer was conducted in English, loud enough for everyone to hear. It quickly became clear that the officer had no interest in peaceful resolution. "You are accused of raiding settlements and stealing property," the officer declared. You will surrender immediately and submit to escort back to the reservation designated for your people. Any resistance will be met with force. We have raided no one, the elder replied with quiet dignity. We are traveling peacefully to the western lands as the government has demanded. We want no trouble with anyone. The officer's response was swift and brutal. You have a white woman in your camp, he announced, having spotted Margaret despite her traditional clothing. This is evidence of kidnapping and unlawful detention. Surrender her immediately, or we will take her by force. Margaret felt ice forming in her stomach. Somehow, news of her escape from Brennan's settlement had reached the military. She was being used as justification for whatever violence was about to unfold. Before anyone could respond, she stepped forward. I am not kidnapped, she called out clearly. I am here by my own choice. The officer's cold eyes fixed on her. Miss O'Sullivan, you have been reported as kidnapped from Joshua Brennan's settlement. You will come with us immediately. I was not kidnapped, Margaret repeated, her voice growing stronger. I was sold to Brennan against my will. I escaped on my own and sought refuge with these people, who have shown me nothing but kindness. That's enough, the officer snapped. You are clearly confused or under duress. Soldiers retrieved the woman and prepared to arrest the ringleaders of this band. That's when Ayana stepped forward, moving to stand beside his wife. The woman you seek to take is my wife, he announced in a voice that carried across the clearing. She is under my protection and the protection of our people. The officer laughed harshly. Marriage between a white woman and an Indian savage is not recognized by any civilized authority. Stand aside, or you will be shot where you stand. Margaret saw the soldiers raising their rifles and knew that words would not be enough to prevent bloodshed. But she also knew something that might give them an advantage. Joshua Brennan is a thief, she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. He has been stealing from the Choctaw people for months, horses, supplies, everything he could take. He called you here not to rescue me, but to eliminate the witnesses to his crimes.
The certainty in her voice gave some of the soldiers pause.
Margaret could see doubt beginning to appear on a few faces as they processed her accusation. She speaks truth, the tribal elder added. We have proof of what was taken from us, marks that identify our stolen property. This man Brennan has grown rich from theft, and now he uses the law to protect his crimes. The officer's face had grown red with anger, but Margaret could see uncertainty in his eyes. He had expected to find savage Indians holding a helpless white woman captive. Instead, he was faced with serious allegations against the man who had sent him here. Even if what you say is true, he said finally, it does not change the fact that you are ordered to report to the Western Reservation. You will come with us, or you will be forced to come. That's when Nayeli stepped forward, moving with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to respect and authority. Officer, she said in perfect English, her voice carrying the wisdom of her years.
You speak of law and civilization.
Let me ask you, what law gives you the right to break apart a lawful marriage? What civilization demands that a wife be separated from her husband by force? The question hung in the air, and Margaret could see it had hit home with some of the soldiers. These were not all evil men. Some were simply doing what they believed was their duty, following orders without fully understanding the situation. Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She pulled the carved ring from her finger and held it up where everyone could see it. This ring, she said, her voice clear and strong, was placed on my hand last night by my husband, in a ceremony witnessed by his entire community. I am Margaret Ayana now, not Margaret O'Sullivan. I belong to no man but the one I chose. And I go where he goes. She looked directly at the officer as she continued. You can force us to go west to the reservation. You can even separate me from my husband if you insist on following unjust orders. But you cannot undo a marriage made in love and witnessed before God and this community. The standoff stretched on for several tense minutes. Margaret could see the officers struggling with a situation that clearly fell outside his experience and training. Finally, one of his sergeants approached and whispered something in his ear. The officer's expression changed as he listened to his subordinate's words. When the man finished speaking, the officer looked back at the assembled Choctaw community with new uncertainty. It seems, he said slowly, that there are questions about the authority under which I was sent here. Questions that need to be answered before any further action is taken. Margaret held her breath, sensing that something important was shifting in their favor. The sergeant stepped forward and addressed the tribal elder directly. Sir, he said respectfully, I've been tasked with informing you that the territorial government is investigating allegations of illegal land seizure and theft involving several prominent citizens. Until that investigation is complete, my unit has been ordered to ensure your safe passage to the designated reservation lands, not to detain or arrest anyone. The relief that swept through the Choctaw community was almost tangible. Margaret felt Ayana's arm tighten around her as they realized that somehow, inexplicably, justice was beginning to work in their favor. The officer, clearly unhappy with this development but unable to argue with direct orders, made the best of an uncomfortable situation. "Very well," he said stiffly. "We will provide escort to ensure your safe passage to Oklahoma Territory, but the woman comes with us for questioning regarding the allegations she has made." "No," Ayana said firmly. "My wife stays with me and our people. If there are questions to be answered, they can be answered here, in the presence of her family." The negotiation continued for another hour, but eventually a compromise was reached. Margaret would remain with the Choctaw community, but would make herself available to answer questions from territorial investigators when they caught up with the traveling group. The military escort would ensure safe passage for everyone, protection against both hostile settlers and the harsh challenges of the trail ahead. As the combined group prepared to resume their journey west, Margaret found herself reflecting on the incredible transformation her life had undergone. 3 weeks ago, she had been property to be traded. Now she was a wife, a member of a community, and somehow a witness whose testimony might bring justice to those who had been wronged. But more than any of that, she was free. Free to choose her own path, to love whom she wanted to love, to build the kind of life she wanted to live. That evening, as they made camp along the trail that would eventually lead them to their new home in Oklahoma Territory, Margaret sat beside the fire with Ayana, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Her wooden ring caught the firelight, and she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Do you regret anything?" Ayana asked quietly, following her gaze to the ring on her finger. Margaret considered the question seriously. She thought about her father, probably still drinking away his guilt in some tavern back east. She thought about the life she had been expected to live, safe, conventional, and utterly without joy or purpose. She thought about all the paths not taken, all the choices that had led her to this place. "No," she said finally, her voice filled with certainty. "I regret nothing. This ring, this life, this love, it's all worth everything I've lost and more." Ayana smiled and pulled her closer to his side. "Then we will build something beautiful together," he said. "In this new land, with these new opportunities, we will create a life that honors both of our heritages." Margaret looked around the camp, at the families preparing for sleep, at the children who would grow up in a new land with new possibilities, at the elderly people who carried the wisdom of the past into an uncertain future. She thought about the role she would play in this community, the contributions she could make, the children she and Ayana might have together. The ring on her finger was warm against her skin, a constant reminder that some gifts come disguised as losses, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply saying yes to love when it finds you in the most unexpected places. As she drifted off to sleep beside her husband under the vast Oklahoma sky, Margaret reflected on the words Ayana had spoken to her that first day at the river crossing. Every person has worth. Every life has value. She had learned the truth of those words through experience, and now she would spend the rest of her life proving them to the world, one day and one choice at a time. The ring that had changed her fate remained on her finger for the rest of her long and happy life, eventually passed down to her daughter, and then to her granddaughter, carrying with it the story of a love that crossed all boundaries and a choice that led to freedom.